The night in Windmere was cool, with a crisp breeze drifting through the fields. The scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves lingered in the air, and orange-hued jack-o'-lanterns glowed warmly on porches throughout the small rural town. Farmer Jim shuffled onto his creaky front porch, carrying a chipped mug of cider. He plopped himself into his rocking chair, letting out a satisfied grunt as he looked at the pumpkin he'd carved earlier that day, its crooked grin illuminated by a flickering candle inside. It sat proudly beside the door, the grin looking particularly mischievous as the wind teased the flame. Jim sighed, enjoying the moment of quiet. His old hound dog, Baxter, lay at his feet, his ears twitching with every gust of wind. "Ain't no night like a good Halloween night, huh, Bax?" Jim mused, sipping his cider. The hound responded with a lazy groan, shifting his weight on the porch. Just as Jim was about to close his eyes and enjoy the peaceful stillness, a strange hum vibrated through the air. The sound was low, rhythmic, and unsettling, like a swarm of bees buzzing far off in the distance but growing closer. Jim's hand froze halfway to his mouth, and Baxter let out a soft growl, his ears standing upright. The hum grew louder, filling the night with an eerie resonance. The ground beneath Jim's boots trembled slightly. He stood, setting his mug on the railing, his eyes scanning the starry sky. Suddenly, with a bone-rattling boom, a fiery streak tore through the heavens, crashing just beyond the fence line, right into the middle of Jim's pumpkin patch. The explosion sent a shockwave of energy through the field, rattling windows and sending a flock of crows screeching into the night sky. Jim cursed under his breath and grabbed the flashlight from inside the door. "What in tarnation?" he muttered, as Baxter barked nervously at his side. Together, they crossed the creaky wooden steps and made their way toward the patch. The beam of his flashlight cut through the swirling smoke that had spread across the field, and as he drew closer, the sight before him made him freeze. In the heart of his pumpkin patch lay a smooth, metallic craft, smaller than he'd imagined for a spaceship. It shimmered under the moonlight, its surface iridescent and shifting like oil on water. Sparks danced from a cracked panel, and steam hissed from vents along its side. The hatch at the top creaked open with a faint hiss, and from within, two figures tumbled out, their limbs gangly and unsteady as they collapsed onto the soft soil. The aliens were unlike anything Jim had ever imagined. Their skin glowed faintly, a strange mix of violet and silver, with large, pupilless eyes that shimmered like stars. They wore odd-looking jumpsuits that clung to their thin frames, and their hands had too many fingers, each tipped with small, glowing pads. One of them stumbled to its feet, swaying as it tried to steady itself. The other stayed kneeling, its body trembling. Jim's heart pounded, but he did his best to appear calm. "Well, this ain't exactly how I thought first contact would go," he muttered under his breath, tightening his grip on the flashlight. The standing alien glanced around wildly, its gaze landing on the jack-o'-lantern glowing on Jim's porch in the distance. It let out a high-pitched, warbling screech and stumbled backward, almost knocking over its companion. The second alien looked toward the glowing pumpkin, saw the jagged grin flickering in the dark, and immediately dropped to the ground, babbling in a melodic, frantic language that made no sense to Jim. Baxter barked once, low and cautious. Jim gave him a quick pat on the head, though his own nerves were starting to fray. "Whoa. Now, y'all spooked by a pumpkin? It's just a carved gourd with a candle inside." The aliens didn't seem to understand him, but the fear on their faces was unmistakable. They pointed wildly at the jack-o'-lantern and then at Jim, speaking in hurried bursts, their voices rising in pitch. One of them reached into a pouch at its side and pulled out a small, glowing device. A hologram flickered to life in the air between them, revealing a writhing, shadowy mass that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. Jim stared at the image, his skin crawling. The alien pointed frantically at the hologram and then toward the pumpkin, speaking more urgently now. Its voice wavered, and though Jim didn't understand the language, the fear was infectious. The alien's voice broke into fragmented English, the words rough and hesitant. Crawling dark. It comes. Only ward-bearers can stop it. You know the way. Jim squinted at the hologram, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Ward bearers? You mean the pumpkins? These things? He gestured toward the jack-o'-lantern on his porch. Both aliens nodded furiously, their glowing eyes wide with terror. They pointed toward the darkening sky and then back to the pumpkin, as if the glowing grin held the key to salvation. Jim rubbed his face, trying to process the situation. Now, let me get this straight. Y'all traveled across the galaxy 'cause you think our jack-o'-lanterns keep away some kind of space demon. One of the aliens, Jim figured it might be their leader, nodded solemnly. Powerful wards, glowing faces, protect from the crawling dark. We need them. Jim let out a slow whistle, scratching the back of his neck. Well, I'll be damned. Y'all came to learn pumpkin carving from a bunch of Earth folks. The aliens didn't laugh. They just stood there, dead serious, their shimmering skin almost pale with fear. Suddenly, the wind picked up again, howling through the pumpkin patch with a low, mournful wail. The flame inside the jack-o'-lantern flickered wildly, casting long, jittery shadows across the field. Above them, the stars seemed to dim, as if a vast shadow was creeping across the sky. Jim felt a chill settle deep in his bones, and even Baxter let out a low whine, shifting uneasily beside him. The leader alien pointed toward the sky with a trembling hand. It comes. Jim tightened his grip on the flashlight, his pulse pounding in his ears. All right. No need to panic just yet. He looked back toward his house where the other pumpkins sat waiting, their grinning faces glowing faintly in the dark. If all you need is some jack-o'-lanterns to keep that thing away, I reckon we can make a few more. He turned toward the barn, motioning for the aliens to follow. Come on then, we're gonna need a lot more pumpkins. The aliens shuffled after him, their every movement jittery with fear. As they crossed the field, Jim couldn't help but mutter to himself, of all the crazy things, cosmic horrors and pumpkins. The flame in the jack-o'-lantern flickered again, dimming for just a moment before bursting back to life. Far above, beyond the clouds, the first tendrils of the crawling dark stretched toward Earth, and time was running out. Inside the barn, dim light bulbs swayed overhead as Farmer Jim cleared a work table cluttered with tools, ropes, and cans of paint. The two aliens, jittery and uneasy, hovered near the door, as if expecting something to burst in after them at any moment. Baxter curled up in a corner, his eyes flicking between the newcomers and his master. Jim planted his hands on his hips, eyeing the aliens with curiosity and concern. All right, fellas. Time to spill the beans. What exactly are we dealing with here? The taller alien, whom Jim decided to call Slim, activated the same glowing device from earlier. The hologram reappeared, swirling with black tendrils and shimmering specks of light, like a void slowly devouring stars. Slim pointed to the mass, its voice trembling as it pieced together broken English. Crawling, dark, ancient, old as stars. It consumes everything. Jim leaned in, trying to understand. Consumes, huh? So, it eats stuff? Planets? Stars? Slim nodded solemnly. Eats light, sound, life. All gone. When it arrives, silence. Eternal silence. Jim whistled low under his breath. That's some heavy stuff. And you're telling me a couple of carved pumpkins can scare this thing off? Slim gave an exaggerated nod, his companion chiming in with an anxious trill. Yes, the wards. Glowing faces. Protection. Keep it away. Jim scratched his head, baffled. Look, I've been carving pumpkins every Halloween since I was knee-high, but I ain't never heard of 'em holding off no galactic horrors. The shorter alien, who had mostly been silent until now, stepped forward, projecting a new image. It showed other planets, entire civilizations, crumbling into darkness. Massive cities vanished under clouds of writhing shadows, and alien beings of all kinds were swallowed whole, their terrified faces frozen in moments of futile resistance. Jim felt the weight of the images settle in his gut. Y'all weren't kidding. This thing's the real deal. Slim pointed again toward the jack-o'-lanterns on Jim's porch, visibly desperate. No one knows where pumpkins came from, but ancient power, old knowledge, wards, they work. We need them. Jim folded his arms. So, y'all think humans have been protecting ourselves this whole time without even knowing it? Just by carving faces into pumpkins every October? Slim gave an eager, hopeful nod. Yes, you, ward-bearers, must teach us. Our world's too afraid, too late to fight alone. Jim rubbed his chin thoughtfully. It was absurd. A cosmic nightmare held at bay by Halloween decorations. But the panic in the aliens' eyes wasn't fake. And those images of destroyed planets? They weren't just a Halloween story. They were a warning. Baxter let out a small whine, sensing his master's unease. Jim knelt down and gave the old dog a scratch behind the ears. Well, if teaching aliens how to carve pumpkins is all it takes to stop this thing, I guess that's what we'll do. He stood up, grabbed a fresh pumpkin from a nearby pile, and plunked it onto the work table. All right, boys. Time for Pumpkin Carvin' 101. The aliens leaned in, watching intently as Jim pulled out a carving knife. First step, you cut the top off. He demonstrated, slicing around the stem in a neat circle. The aliens flinched at the scraping sound, whispering nervously to each other. Jim lifted the pumpkin's lid and pointed inside. Now, you gotta scoop out the guts. No guts, no glory. He gave the slimy innards a tug, dumping them into a bucket. The shorter alien poked the mess cautiously, as if it might bite. Jim chuckled. Ain't nothing dangerous, just seeds and strings. Y'all gonna want to scoop 'em all out if you want a proper jack-o'-lantern. The aliens exchanged nervous glances, then mimicked Jim's motions with their long, glowing fingers. Slim grabbed a second pumpkin, clumsily sawing at the top with a laser tool. The other alien hesitated, but followed suit. Hey now, Jim warned. No fancy laser gizmos. You do it by hand. Carvin's about feeling the pumpkin out, connecting with it. Slim grumbled, but put the laser tool away, opting instead for the knife Jim handed over. It was awkward at first. Alien hands weren't made for this, but they slowly got the hang of it. Jim grinned. There you go. Now, the fun part. Making the face. He demonstrated by carving 2 jagged triangles for eyes and a crooked grin. The key is to make it look like it's up to something. Mischievous, a little spooky, but not too scary. The aliens carved with intense concentration, their glowing fingers trembling with every cut. Their first attempts were rough, lopsided faces with uneven grins. But Jim gave them a thumbs up. Not bad for your first try. Y'all are naturals. Just as the aliens were gaining confidence, a strange noise echoed from outside, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Baxter perked up, growling low in his throat. Jim tensed, feeling the hair on the back of his neck rise. He moved to the barn door and peeked out. The night outside was unnaturally still, and the jack-o'-lanterns on his porch flickered wildly, their flames sputtering like they were struggling to stay lit. Slim joined him at the door, his voice trembling. It's here, crawling dark, near. A chill ran down Jim's spine. He grabbed the carving knife from the table and handed it to the shorter alien. We ain't done yet. If them pumpkins are all that's keeping this thing at bay, we better get to carving faster. The aliens nodded frantically and dove back into their work, scooping and carving with newfound urgency. Jim joined them, sweat beading on his brow as he worked on another jack-o'-lantern. Outside, the whispers grew louder, and the sky above the pumpkin patch darkened further. Tendrils of shadow slithered across the stars, inching closer to the earth. The barn lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows over the pumpkins. Baxter barked sharply, his tail tucked between his legs. The air grew colder, and Jim knew they were running out of time. With one final cut, Jim finished his latest jack-o'-lantern. He lit a candle inside and set it on the workbench, its mischievous grin glowing defiantly in the dim barn light. The aliens followed suit, lighting their own pumpkins one by one. As the flames flickered to life, the room seemed to grow warmer, the oppressive weight in the air lifting ever so slightly. Jim exhaled slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. There, that ought to hold it off for now. Slim peered out the barn door, his eyes wide with fear. Not enough. We need more. Many more. Jim nodded grimly. Then we best get carvin'. We're gonna need every pumpkin in this town. The whispers outside grew fainter, but they didn't disappear. The crawling dark was still out there, waiting, circling, looking for a way in. And if they didn't have enough jack-o'-lanterns ready by the time it arrived in full force, well, Jim didn't want to think about that. He grabbed another pumpkin and set to work. Ain't no cosmic horror taking down this farm. Not tonight. The aliens, their hands steady now, carved alongside him, their fear replaced by determination. They were in this together now, humans aliens and pumpkins, fighting to keep the darkness at bay. Because if a little light and a mischievous grin were all it took to hold back the end of everything, then, by God, they were going to make the best damn jack-o'-lanterns the universe had ever seen. By the time dawn rolled in, the barn had turned into a chaotic workshop filled with half-carved pumpkins, stray seeds, and exhausted but determined faces. Farmer Jim wiped the sweat off his brow, hands covered in pumpkin guts, as the two aliens, Slim and his jittery companion, hovered anxiously over their latest creations. A flickering row of jack-o'-lanterns sat along the barn walls, their mismatched faces glowing with eerie defiance. But they still needed more. Slim inspected one of the pumpkins he had carved, a rough attempt at a scowling grin, and tilted his head. "Good?" he asked nervously, his glowing eyes wide with uncertainty. Jim squinted at the crooked grin. "Well, it's not going to win any county fair contests, but it'll do the job." He gave Slim a reassuring pat on the back. "Remember, the trick ain't perfection. It's about the spirit you put in it. These jack-o'-lanterns gotta say, 'Hey, scary thing, get lost.'" The aliens exchanged glances, nodding in solemn understanding. It seemed absurd to them, a concept so simple, almost playful, yet powerful enough to drive back a cosmic nightmare. But they were fully committed. They had to be. Slim raised his carving knife and turned to another pumpkin with newfound determination. His companion, whom Jim had unofficially nicknamed Jitters, wasn't faring as well. Jitters stared at his half-scooped pumpkin with a mixture of frustration and despair, muttering something in his alien tongue. Jim leaned over. "What's the holdup there, partner? Don't be shy. Dig right in. Ain't no wrong way to carve a pumpkin." Jitters let out a weary sigh and attempted to telepathically scoop the pumpkin guts with his glowing fingers. The pumpkin wobbled on the table, then flipped over, splattering its insides all over the alien's jumpsuit. He stared at the mess, horrified, while Slim stifled a chittering laugh. Jim chuckled. "Ain't no shame in getting your hands dirty. Here, try using a spoon." He handed over an oversized ladle. Jitters took it tentatively, like a sacred relic, then got back to work, scooping with exaggerated care. Meanwhile, the barn doors creaked open, and a gust of cool morning air swept in. Jim turned to see his neighbors, folks from all over Windmere, trickling in, curious about the ruckus at the farm. Mrs. Thompson, from down the road, peeked inside, holding a casserole dish, her eyes wide at the sight of glowing alien figures elbow-deep in pumpkins. "Jim, what in the world is going on here?" she asked, balancing the dish on her hip. Jim grinned, wiping his hands on his overalls. "Mornin', Edna. Long story short, we got some visitors from way out of town, and we're teaching them how to carve pumpkins to stop a galaxy-eaten shadow monster." Mrs. Thompson blinked. Her jaw slacked. "You're what?" Jim gestured toward the aliens who were deeply engrossed in their pumpkin carving. "Yup, turns out these here pumpkins are powerful wards against cosmic horrors. Who knew, right?" She squinted at the glowing jack-o'-lanterns lined up along the walls, her skepticism giving way to cautious acceptance. "Well, if that's the case," she set her casserole dish down and rolled up her sleeves. "Might as well lend a hand." By mid-morning, the barn was bustling with activity. Half the town had shown up, each person grabbing a pumpkin and carving with enthusiasm, whether out of belief, curiosity, or just to be part of the strangest community project in history. Carving stations were set up along the walls, and soon the barn was filled with the rhythmic scrape of spoons and the sound of laughter, interrupted occasionally by Slim's anxious reminders to keep the faces spooky. Even the kids got involved, though most of them treated the event like a strange Halloween carnival. Little Timmy Baxter poked his finger into a pumpkin's eye socket, grinning up at Jitters. "Is this scary enough?" he asked. Jitters examined the child's work with a critical eye, then gave an enthusiastic nod. "Perfect. Very menacing." Jim stood at the center of it all, hands on his hips, feeling an odd sense of pride. He'd started the night thinking he was just an old farmer with a bunch of pumpkins, and now here he was, leading an intergalactic effort to save the universe with jack-o'-lanterns. But time was running out. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the sky darkened once more, not just with nightfall, but with something more sinister. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the fields, and a cold wind swept through the barn, sending a shiver down everyone's spine. Slim glanced nervously out the barn doors. "It comes soon." Jim clapped his hands together, his voice carrying over the chatter. "All right, folks. We're in the home stretch now. Light 'em up and set 'em out. Every pumpkin counts." One by one, the townsfolk lit their jack-o'-lanterns, the flickering flames casting eerie, playful grins. Rows of glowing faces lined the barn, porch railings and fences, spreading out toward the fields like tiny beacons of defiance. The aliens moved among them, whispering words of thanks and awe, their anxiety easing as the number of jack-o'-lanterns grew. But just as hope began to swell, disaster struck. A loud crack echoed through the barn as one of the pumpkins, an especially large one, split in half, its flame sputtering out. Slim let out a panicked shriek, pointing toward the shattered pieces. "No! Broken ward! Bad omen!" Everyone froze, hearts pounding in unison. Jim grabbed his flashlight and shined it toward the barn doors. Beyond the pumpkin-lined fences, the shadows writhed and twisted, creeping closer, drawn by the gap in their defenses. "We ain't got time to panic," Jim shouted, snapping everyone out of their trance. "Grab anything round and start carving. Melons, squash, coconuts, I don't care what it is. Just make it scary." The townsfolk sprang into action, rushing to the nearby farm stands and gathering every round fruit or vegetable they could find. Slim and Jitters grabbed armfuls of watermelons, their hands moving frantically as they carved jagged faces into the green rinds. Jim himself tackled a giant gourd, carving a grotesque grin with wild determination. "Ain't no cosmic horror taking us down over one busted pumpkin," he muttered through gritted teeth. The barn became a frenzy of last-minute carving. Faces of every shape and size emerged from unlikely objects, grinning coconuts, snarling squashes, even a few pineapples that looked surprisingly sinister. As the last of the improvised jack-o'-lanterns were lit and placed along the fences, the shadows outside faltered, hesitating at the edge of the glowing perimeter. The eerie whispers that had haunted the night grew fainter, retreating like smoke on the wind. Slim let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "It works," Jim grinned, lighting the final coconut with a flourish. "Told ya, ain't nothing more powerful than a little creativity, and maybe some stubbornness." The crowd cheered, their fear replaced by triumph. But Jim knew better than to celebrate too early. The shadows were still out there, waiting, testing their defenses for the slightest weakness. He turned to Slim and Jitters, his expression serious. "We ain't out of the woods yet. Keep an eye on those lights. If even one of them goes out." Jitters gave a solemn nod, his glowing fingers trembling slightly. "We will watch, always." Jim patted him on the back. "Good, 'cause the night ain't over, and neither is this fight." The night thickened like spilled ink, pressing in from all sides. The flickering jack-o'-lanterns cast dancing shadows that twisted across the barn walls and along the fences. Inside, the glow of the carved gourds offered a fragile sense of hope, but everyone knew it was temporary. The crawling dark was out there, testing their defenses, waiting for its moment. Jim stood at the open barn doors, squinting into the night. Cold tendrils of wind slipped through the cracks, carrying the faint sound of eerie whispers. Every flicker of a pumpkin's flame made his pulse quicken. They had done their best, more pumpkins than anyone thought possible, but it still felt like holding back a flood with paper towels. Slim shuffled to Jim's side, his glowing eyes wide with fear. "It waits, hungry. We need more." Jim exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. "We gave it all we got, Slim. Now, we just gotta hope it's enough." But the words rang hollow. The crawling dark wasn't just going to stop because a bunch of humans carved some pumpkins. It was out there, massive, ancient, and patient. If even one of those flames sputtered out for good, the entire defense could unravel. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the night. Jim's heart leapt into his throat as one of the jack-o'-lanterns by the fence line collapsed. The candle inside snuffed out. The crawling dark responded immediately, a shadowy tendril slithering forward, inching closer to the barn. Jitters cried out in alarm, rushing toward the fallen pumpkin, but it was too late. The defense had weakened, and the shadows began to spread. Jim swore under his breath. "All right, folks, new plan. Grab anything round If it's got a face, we can light it. Chaos erupted as everyone scrambled to find replacements. Children ran to the vegetable crates, hauling out watermelons, squash, and coconuts. One man even found an old basketball, which he handed over to Jitters, who looked at it with bewildered reverence. Mrs. Thompson, sleeves rolled up, carved jagged eyes into a cantaloupe with fierce precision. "I never thought I'd spend my night saving the world with melons," she muttered. Jim grabbed a pumpkin-sized turnip from the corner, hacking into it with his carving knife. "It ain't the size of the gourd that counts. It's the spirit in the grin," he shouted, hoping to inspire his ragtag crew. Jitters nodded solemnly, using a spoon to scoop out the insides of a pineapple. He carved a jagged, lopsided grin, holding it up proudly. Jim gave him a thumbs up. "That'll do, Jitters, that'll do." With every new face carved, the light spread again. The crawling dark hesitated at the edge of the glow, its advance faltering. The improvised lanterns, watermelons, pineapples, and squash blazed to life, holding the darkness at bay. But it was a fragile defense, and everyone knew it. Slim muttered in broken English, "More light, need more." Jim glanced around, his mind racing. There had to be something they hadn't thought of yet, some way to bolster their defenses. His eyes landed on an old string of Christmas lights tangled in a box near the barn wall. A wild idea sparked in his mind. "All right, listen up," Jim shouted. "We're going to string these lights between the pumpkins. Link the whole lot of them. If we keep the glow connected, maybe we can trick that thing into thinking it can't break through." Without waiting for approval, Jim started unraveling the lights. The neighbors pitched in, threading the string through the eyes and mouths of the jack-o'-lanterns and tying them to the new makeshift lanterns. Soon, the entire perimeter glowed like a constellation of mischievous grins, all connected by a web of twinkling light. The crawling dark hissed from the edge of the field, its tendrils retreating slightly. The whispers in the wind grew angrier, more insistent, but the lights held. For now. Slim let out a shaky breath. "It works?" Jim gave him a crooked grin. "It's holding for now, but we ain't out of this yet." Just as the tension began to ease, a sudden gust of wind howled through the barn, extinguishing half the pumpkins in one cruel breath. The shadows surged forward, tendrils snaking between the gaps, coiling around the edges of the light. "Damn it," Jim cursed. "Everyone, grab something and light it up. We need every flame we can get." The barn erupted into chaos once more. People lit candles, flashlights, and even the gas lanterns Jim kept for emergencies. Jitters frantically tried to relight a watermelon with a match, muttering alien prayers under his breath. Jim worked fast, reigniting every jack-o'-lantern within reach. But the crawling dark was relentless, probing every weak spot, pressing closer with every passing second. "We need more fire," Slim cried, panic creeping into his voice. "More light." Jim's mind raced. Fire, light. What else could they use? His gaze landed on a stack of old gasoline cans in the corner of the barn. A dangerous idea formed in his mind, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He grabbed one of the cans and turned to Slim. "All right, Slim. You ever hear of a bonfire?" Slim tilted his head, confused. "Bonfire?" Jim grinned, a wild gleam in his eye. "You're about to." He hauled the gasoline can outside, pouring it in a wide circle around the barn's perimeter. The neighbors followed, spreading fuel across the ground, careful to avoid the pumpkins and lanterns. Jim lit a rag, stuck it in a bottle, and tossed it toward the fuel line. With a whoosh, the ground ignited, a wall of fire roaring to life around the barn. The crawling dark recoiled, hissing and writhing as the flames cut off its advance. The neighbors cheered as the bonfire blazed, the combined light from the flames and jack-o'-lanterns forming an unbreakable barrier. For the first time all night, it felt like they had the upper hand. Slim stared in awe at the roaring fire. "Humans, very creative." Jim clapped him on the back. "We ain't got much, Slim, but we make do." The crawling dark retreated further, shrinking back toward the edges of the field. The whispers in the wind grew fainter, frustrated, like a predator denied its prey. But Jim knew better than to let his guard down. "Keep those lanterns lit," he warned. "This thing ain't done with us yet." As if in response, the shadows coiled at the far edge of the firelight, waiting for the flames to die down. Jim gritted his teeth. They'd bought themselves time, but not much. "We're gonna need more fuel," he muttered, already calculating how long the bonfire would last. "And more pumpkins, lots more." Jitters gave a solemn nod, his glowing fingers steady now. "We will carve, always." Jim smiled, despite the exhaustion tugging at him. "That's the spirit, Jitters. Let's show this thing what humans and pumpkins are made of." They weren't out of the woods yet, but for the first time, Jim felt like they had a fighting chance. And as long as the lights burned bright and the pumpkins grinned defiantly, the crawling dark didn't stand a chance. The fire roared around the barn, throwing sparks into the night, but Jim knew it wouldn't last. The crawling dark coiled at the edge of the flames, waiting with eerie patience for the moment the blaze weakened. The jack-o'-lanterns flickered along the perimeter, grinning defiantly, but the air felt heavier by the second, as though the darkness pressed down on the light with all its ancient weight. Inside the barn, neighbors carved like mad, scooping and slicing everything they could find. Pumpkins, squash, melons, even random objects that didn't seem like they should work. Slim and Jitters were right in the middle of it, their glowing fingers deftly cutting jagged faces into anything with a round surface. The air was filled with the scent of pumpkin guts and smoke, the odd combination of creativity and survival blending in a way that only humanity could pull off. Jim paced near the barn doors, his eyes flicking toward the fire. It was already burning lower, the fuel dwindling too fast. He could hear the faint whispers of the crawling dark, waiting for its moment. They were running out of time. "How's it comin', folks?" Jim called, trying to keep his voice steady. Mrs. Thompson wiped sweat from her brow, holding up a particularly sinister-looking pineapple. "We're getting there. But we need more hands." Jim nodded grimly. "Keep at it. Every face counts." Jitters lit another melon with shaking hands, his glowing eyes filled with determination. "We not stop, must carve." Slim carved silently beside him, his focus razor-sharp. They had transformed from frightened aliens into skilled jack-o'-lantern artisans, proof that desperate times could teach anyone new skills. Outside, the wind howled, and a tendril of shadow slithered closer to the barn, testing the firelight. Jim grabbed a nearby torch and thrust it toward the encroaching darkness. "Back, you damn thing!" he growled, holding the flame high. The shadow recoiled, but not far. It was getting bolder, hungrier. "We need something bigger," Jim muttered to himself, "something that'll really make this thing think twice." Then it hit him, the old tractor. The ancient machine had sat unused for years, parked near the barn, covered in rust and cobwebs, but it was big, sturdy, and, most importantly, full of diesel fuel. Jim grabbed Slim and Jitters. "Come on, boys. We're making ourselves a giant jack-o'-lantern." They followed him out to the tractor, their eyes wide with confusion but ready to follow his lead. Jim climbed onto the hood and motioned for them to start cutting. "Carve a face right on the front, big eyes, big mouth, make it mean." Slim and Jitters got to work, their glowing fingers cutting deep into the rusty metal with surprising precision. Sparks flew as they carved jagged eyes and a twisted grin into the tractor's hood. Jim filled the engine with the last of the gasoline, praying the old machine would start. He jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and roared to life. A cheer erupted from the barn as the monstrous metal jack-o'-lantern tractor sprang to life, its carved face glowing from the firelight reflecting off the metal. "That's what I'm talking about," Jim whooped, slamming the tractor into gear. He turned to Slim and Jitters. "Light it up." They stuffed candles into the carved holes, and the tractor's face blazed to life, a terrifying metal jack-o'-lantern grinning into the night. Jim drove it toward the edge of the field, where the crawling dark lurked, waiting. The shadows recoiled as the glowing tractor rolled forward, its twisted grin daring them to come closer. Jim revved the engine, the roar of the machine cutting through the whispers of the darkness. "All right, you cosmic son of a gun," Jim muttered, gripping the wheel. "Let's see how you like this." With a wild grin, he plowed the tractor straight into the heart of the crawling dark. The metal jack-o'-lantern smashed through the shadowy tendrils, scattering them like smoke. The darkness writhed and hissed, shrinking back from the glowing, grinning machine.